I've been with my wife, Natalie, for almost 2 decades now. Can you believe it? Our anniversary is coming up on December 10th. Despite everything, I wouldn't change a thing about our life together. Sure, we had our fights, but the making up was always worth it. That's just how we were. We had a rough patch early on in our second year, but after that it was smooth sailing. We got hitched young, me at 20 and Natalie at 18. We grew up around the corner from each other, practically inseparable. My older brother Michael married Natalie's sister Ella a year before us, so it just felt like the natural next step. The challenge came when Michael and Ella had a baby in their first year of marriage, but we struggled. We went through all kinds of tests, even though the doctors told us not to stress and let things happen on their own. Natalie's mom, though, was relentless. She pushed us hard to start a family, especially since she only had daughters other than Ella. My mother-in-law, Margaret, was desperate for a grandson after a life full of girls. The test results were a mixed bag. Natalie was fine, but I had a slightly low sperm count or something like that. To be honest, I never got all the details. The doctor said it wasn't a big deal and told us to be patient. They promised our first baby would come when the time was right. Even though we tried to stay calm, the pressure took a toll on our marriage. Luckily, we didn't have to wait too long. In our third year, Natalie gave birth, just like the doctor had predicted. Sophia arrived, our beautiful baby girl. That put our worries about having kids to rest. After that, things settled down, and our marriage grew even stronger. We were more relaxed. Soon after, Natalie got pregnant again, and this time we had a son, Liam. The whole family was thrilled. It's not that we loved our daughters any less, but having a son was something special for us. I was the first to have a son, and I proudly told my big brother. He just grinned and said to give him time. Sure enough, the next year, they had their first son too. 8 months later, we welcomed another son, Noah. It felt like we were waiting forever for kids, and then suddenly, we had a house full of them. With 2 boys and 2 girls, our home was bustling and lively. Even after Natalie's other sisters got married, they remained close, keeping our extended family tight-knit. It was fantastic for the kids, always having aunts and uncles around to look after them. From what I saw, the other couples seemed just as content as Natalie and I, savoring the simple pleasures of married life surrounded by family. We had our share of tough times, like when Michael had a nasty work accident. I was right there with him, giving my blood for his transfusion. He pulled through, and I was fine too. We joked about being true blood brothers after that. As our 20th anniversary loomed, we started thinking about how to celebrate. Michael and Ella had thrown a fantastic party for theirs the previous year, so we decided to follow suit. We reserved a private room at the local hotel for a big family and friends gathering. Then there was Sophia, our stunning 17-year-old daughter. She was like a younger, even prettier version of her mother, with glossy dark brown hair and striking green eyes that drew everyone's gaze. Her slim figure and long legs made her the center of attention, though as her dad, I tried not to think about that too much. She always had a line of boyfriends, and there was always one of them hanging around the house. But Sophia was sensible, so we didn't worry too much. Liam, our almost 16-year-old, was built solid like me. He had a passion for rugby, just like Michael and I did when we were his age. He was already a regular player at fly half for his school's first team. And then there was young Noah, our youngest. He was struggling a bit, not as athletic as Liam, or as popular as Sophia. Poor Noah was having a tough time finding his place. Noah was always the smart one, probably the brightest of the bunch, even though he acted like a typical, confusing teenager. Maybe I should have been more patient that day. Maybe I should have just cleaned up the mess he left on the dining table. But did I? Nope. You're not going out until you clean up that mess, Noah, I said, trying to keep my cool. I'll do it later, he mumbled, sulking. You'll do it now, I insisted, feeling my patience slipping away. Why do you always pick on me? He shouted, his temper flaring. I'm not picking on you, I shot back. You're part of this family, and you need to follow the rules like everyone else. And who's gonna make me? Noah nearly screamed, his face red with anger. I will, I said, my voice rising. I'm your father, and you'll do as I say. My father, huh? He yelled back, his words like a punch to the gut. Are you sure about that? I stood there stunned, my words caught in my throat. Sorry, Dad, Noah quickly said, his face full of regret. I didn't mean it. I'll clean up right away. Without another word, he turned away and started clearing the table, gathering his books and other stuff. In minutes, the mess was gone, and he hurried out of the room, leaving me reeling, wondering if my world was about to fall apart. Noah was always different from the other two. He was more into his studies, more serious, and less outgoing. I often wondered why he was so different. I even talked to Natalie about it, but she just shrugged it off, saying I was imagining things. Was I really? What made Noah say that? If he had just yelled it in anger and walked away, I would have been mad, but it would have ended there. But he apologized so quickly and took back his words. Why? What did he know that I didn't? Oh no. I really didn't want to entertain the troubling thoughts swirling in my mind at that moment. My first impulse was to track down Natalie and demand some answers. But what good would that do? What could I possibly say? I couldn't just accuse her of cheating without any evidence. If she had been unfaithful, she'd deny it. And if she hadn't, how could she ever forgive me for doubting her? Besides, it had been over 16 years. But did that even matter? Was this still happening? My stomach churned, and I felt a wave of nausea. I still didn't know if I had a legitimate reason to worry. Oh God, what a terrible day. Blood types. That's it, I thought. Without wasting any time, I went to our study and pulled out the kids' medical records. Sophia, Liam, and Noah were all listed as O positive, which I knew matched my own blood type from when I donated to my brother. I felt a momentary sense of relief until I realized that blood types alone didn't tell the whole story. If Noah had a different blood type, that would be one thing, but them all having the same type could simply be a coincidence and didn't necessarily confirm that Noah was truly my son. What should I do now? DNA testing? I couldn't believe I was considering such an extreme step over one angry comment from my son. I was probably overreacting, but when Noah avoided eye contact during dinner that evening and left the table in silence, my worry only grew. What's wrong with Noah? Natalie asked, noticing his strange behavior. I have no idea, I replied with a shrug. Do you guys know anything? They shook their heads, seemingly unaware of any issues. Has he been upset about something? I pressed, but they shook their heads again. Once the kids had left the table, I gathered the courage to bring it up with Natalie. Noah seems so different from the other two, Natalie. Any thoughts on why? Let's not dwell on that, Ethan, she said, getting up to clear the dishes. He's just a bit more introspective than the others. End of story. Was she deliberately avoiding the topic or was she genuinely unconcerned? I couldn't tell. Why not consider DNA testing? 20 minutes later, I was already online, researching my options. An hour later, my head was spinning with information, but I still didn't have any closer to an answer. It wasn't until Monday morning that I finally located a lab capable of performing the test. It took me almost an hour to find them, and my secretary could have probably handled it faster. But how do you explain to your secretary why you need a lab test? Exactly. That's why I took care of it myself. The lab was able to do the test without any issues, but it was pricey, especially if I wanted the results quickly. I had to know before risking my marriage. When I explained that I needed the results before jeopardizing my marriage, they suggested sending in samples from all 3 kids for a cross-check, along with one of my own. Ever tried getting a hair sample from your teenage kids? It's not easy, let me tell you. And with Noah avoiding me as much as possible, it was the toughest of all. But I managed to collect the samples, sent them off, and now all I could do was wait to find out if Noah was really my son. Over the next week, Noah seemed to settle down, probably relieved I hadn't mentioned his outburst. We almost reached a point where I felt I could gently bring it up with him, but I decided it was best to wait for the results. Now that I was on this path, my wife continued to be her usual loving self, and nothing else changed in our daily routine. Our intimacy might not have been the most passionate during that time, but I didn't turn her down. Despite my attempts to hide my doubts from Natalie, I couldn't engage in intimacy without wondering if someone else had been involved. One evening, we had dinner with my brother and his wife. When my brother and I had a moment alone, I almost confessed my worries to him. We were so similar in so many ways, so if someone else fathered Noah, it logically couldn't have been him. Why was I even entertaining such thoughts? Was I already that paranoid? Something held me back, though. I didn't want to burden him with my uncertainties, and deep down I believed he would support me if the results turned out unfavorable. I kept my composure and stayed silent. So quiet that Natalie asked a few times if everything was all right. I reassured her, saying I had a lot on my mind. She looked worried for a moment but didn't press further. The results arrived, and I had them sent to my office just in case Natalie arrived before me and opened the letter. With trembling hands, I read through it, trying to make sense of it all. Could this piece of paper spell the end of my marriage? After reading it, I saw that Noah's results matched mine, and I felt a huge wave of relief, even though the medical jargon was like a foreign language to me. The report was full of terms like good match and close match, which suggested that my fears were unfounded. What a relief. Tears welled up in my eyes as I thanked my lucky stars that I hadn't shared my doubts with Natalie. I decided to make it up to her that evening, perhaps by taking her out to dinner. However, as I reread the covering letter, which I hadn't paid much attention to before, I noticed that the lab wanted me to call them to discuss the results. I figured they were just trying to squeeze more money out of me and wasn't sure if it was worth the hassle. When I called, I introduced myself as Ethan Blake and mentioned that Dr. Roberts had asked me to call. After a few references, I finally got through to the doctor. "Hello, Mr. Blake," he greeted me. "Have you had a chance to review the results we sent you?" "Yes," I replied confidently. "It seems my concerns about Noah were unfounded." "Yes, indeed," he responded, "but it's not quite that simple." My heart sank as I braced myself for bad news. "You mean he's not my son?" I stammered. "It's not that, Mr. Blake," he clarified. "There's less than a 1 in a million chance that he's not your biological child. I'm confident that he is your natural-born son." I sighed with relief. So Noah is my real son after all. "Yes, he is, Mr. Blake," the doctor said. "But what's the issue?" I asked, feeling a wave of uncertainty. What else could possibly be wrong? My mind was racing because I'd heard that DNA tests could also uncover genetic disorders. "It's the other 2 samples you sent in," the doctor said gravely. "What about the samples from my son's brother and sister?" I asked, my panic rising. "Is there something wrong with one of them?" "Well," he began, "it appears that they are only half-siblings to your youngest son." "Half-siblings?" I echoed, stunned. "What does that mean, doctor? What's a half-sibling?" "It means," he continued, "that it's highly unlikely that you are their biological father." The phone slipped from my hand, and before I knew it, I was surrounded by my concerned coworkers as I struggled to regain consciousness. "Give him some air," someone called out as I slowly came to, gasping for breath. "Are you okay, Ethan?" another voice asked. I nodded weakly, attempting to stand. They helped me back into my chair, chatting among themselves about workload and office temperature. It all felt so trivial compared to the bombshell I had just received. Thankfully, someone arranged for me to be driven home and urged me to take the rest of the day off. When I arrived and found the house empty, with Natalie at work and the kids at school, I knew what I had to do next. I dreaded making the call, but it was necessary. With trembling fingers, I dialed the laboratory's number again, and soon found myself speaking with the doctor once more. "I'm sorry for the abrupt end to our last conversation," I said. "No worries, Mr. Blake," he reassured me. "Our postal service can be tricky sometimes." I assured him that I understood, and he patiently reviewed the test results with me again. "Noah is definitely your son," he confirmed, "but Sophia and Liam are unlikely to be your biological children." "But the results showed good or close matches," I pleaded. "Could there be a mistake?" I asked, desperately clinging to any shred of hope. "If we had only one sample, we might request another for verification," the doctor explained. "But with 2 samples, the likelihood is almost certain. While Sophia and Liam are full siblings, it's unlikely that you're their biological father." "But you said the matches were close," I insisted, holding on to a glimmer of hope. "What does that mean? Do you have a twin or a brother, Mr. Blake?" the doctor asked cautiously. "Or perhaps another relative?" "My brother?" I exclaimed, a surge of excitement washing over me. "What does my brother have to do with this?" "You'll have to draw your own conclusions, Mr. Blake." The doctor's voice droned on, but I barely registered his words. My world had shattered into a million pieces. What should I do now? Should I end my marriage and sever my lifelong bond with my brother? You can't choose your family after all. Should I just pretend I didn't know anything and continue living a lie? The thought was unbearable. And what about Noah? He knew something was off, but he had the wrong idea. From now on, I'd have to see my son differently, But I couldn't love Sophia and Liam any less. They were my children, regardless of whose genes they carried, and no piece of paper could change that. But Natalie, now that was the real question. What about that witch and my jerk of a brother too? How would Ella, my sister-in-law, react? How would the rest of the family handle the news? So many questions swirled in my mind. This was all so overwhelming, and I didn't feel prepared to face it. I vaguely remember stepping out of the front door and beginning to walk down the street. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital with bandages on my arms. I had stumbled into the path of a car while completely out of it, but I had no memory of that at the time. "Ethan, are you all right?" I turned to see who had spoken, wincing in pain. Then I recognized the voice and realized it was my ex-wife talking to me. "Not really, not yet anyway," I replied, feeling the weight of the situation. She was still my wife, but I couldn't find the right words. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, honey, I just discovered that 2 of our kids aren't mine and you've been having an affair with my brother. How was your day? What's for dinner?" Yeah, that didn't quite hit the mark, did it? Anyway, my injuries weren't severe, so they sent me home the next day. I couldn't do much on my own, so I relied on Natalie to take care of me. It gave me time to think and plan, but honestly, it felt like a futile exercise because I still didn't know what to do. The main concern now was Noah and the other 2 kids. Whatever decision I made had to prioritize their well-being, even if it meant sacrificing my own needs. Natalie's needs were at the bottom of my list for now. Our 20th anniversary was approaching, and the room was booked for our big dinner. I had to figure things out before then. Within about a week, I was physically back to normal, or at least as close as I could get. Everything seemed to fall back into place while I contemplated my next move. But Noah was different. He seemed to be on edge, the right age to start acting out. "You should talk to him, Ethan," Natalie suggested one evening. "I don't know what's bothering him. He doesn't seem to want to talk to me anymore." "I'll have a chat with him," I promised. "Any idea what might be going on with him?" she asked. "I've got a few thoughts," I replied shortly, catching her off guard. "Want to talk about them?" "Not really," I said, and that threw her off even more. The chance to talk came the next day when I found Noah alone in his room. He couldn't avoid me. "Want to talk about what's bothering you, son?" I began gently. He just shook his head, unwilling to open up. "Is it about the other day, Noah? About our relationship?" I pressed, noticing a maturity in him that took me by surprise. "You don't understand, Dad," he said, challenging me. "I might know more than you think." "I might know more than you realize, too," I countered, trying to keep a reassuring smile on my face. "Then why don't you do something about it, Dad?" He pushed back. "Why do you let them get away with it?" Wait a minute. This wasn't going where I expected. It sounded like we were discussing something completely different. "Get away with what, son?" I asked, thoroughly confused. "You really don't know, Dad?" he repeated. "Apparently not, son," I admitted. "It's Mom and Uncle John," he whispered, "when you're at work, about once a month or so." His voice trembled with embarrassment. I muttered a curse under my breath. John wasn't Natalie's husband. He was married to another one of Natalie's sisters. "Oh," I mumbled, feeling completely lost for words. "They've been doing it for years, Dad," Noah continued, his voice cracking. "Sophia thinks I'm John's son, not yours." At that, he broke down in tears. I wrapped my arms around him, trying to offer comfort. It had been a long time since I'd held him like this, and I was taken aback by how strong and grown up he felt. "I can guarantee you, Noah," I said firmly, holding him close. "You are my son in every way, not John's." "How can you be sure, Dad?" he sobbed. "How do you know?" "I'm sure, son," I reassured him with confidence. "Believe me, I'm sure." We talked for a while longer, and I managed to convince him of his true parentage without going into too much detail. It was like lifting a heavy burden off his shoulders. However, I didn't mention my brother's involvement as Sophia and Liam's father. It was clear that my seemingly perfect family wasn't as content as I had believed. Both Sophia and Liam were aware of their mother's affair with their uncle, but they chose to ignore it, unsure of how to handle the situation. It was an awful position for them to be in. As for John, he was the youngest of Natalie's 4 sisters, and arguably the most attractive. While Natalie had her own charm, John's wife added yet another layer of complexity to my already strained marriage. A few days later, I took all 3 kids out for lunch and faced the most challenging task I'd ever encountered: revealing everything I'd discovered. I anxiously awaited their reactions, bracing myself for the worst. To my surprise, they handled the news relatively well. Sophia shed a few tears, and Liam sat with his head in his hands, clearly distressed. Despite their initial shock, all three kids were eager to confront their mother right away. However, I persuaded them to wait, explaining that I needed time to figure things out first. They promised their love and support to me, and some were even ready to sever ties with Natalie altogether. I managed to dissuade them from that drastic step, reminding them that despite her mistakes, Natalie had always been a caring mother. I spoke of her in a way that didn't quite align with my true feelings, especially after learning from the kids that Natalie, my supposedly loving wife, had been involved with John, her brother-in-law, for some time. It was likely that John wasn't Noah's father, as the monthly encounters seemed more like an exaggeration. Still, none of us were completely sure. What was clear, however, was that the kids felt a sense of relief after finally unburdening themselves. They all cried, including Liam, as we gathered together that evening. Correction, all four of us cried. I was consumed by a desire for revenge, but I knew I had to find a way to achieve it without hurting my children. I carefully considered my words and my intentions. I was determined to get revenge, and it was for John as much as it was for my children. I spent some time pondering how best to seek it, but struggled to devise a grand plan. It seemed that a direct confrontation was my only viable option. Thankfully, the upcoming family event on December 10th provided a perfect opportunity. With my parents gone, and Michael and me among the older generation, the event was set to be a large family gathering. 40 of us would be sitting down for a celebratory dinner, primarily consisting of Natalie's side of the family and some of our mutual friends. The meal was served, but to me it might as well have been cardboard and dishwater. As the speeches began, I could feel the sweat pouring off me, my nerves on edge. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading and preparing for. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. What I had to say wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. "Welcome, everyone," I started, trying to ease into it with some light conversation. I turned the topic to our 20 years of marriage, giving a nod to my wife, Natalie. But there was something more personal and unsettling that I needed to share, something that would change everything. Laughter bubbled through the room as jokes about our private life made the rounds. Natalie blushed, thinking it was all in jest. But little did they know how deeply mistaken they were. As the laughter died down, Sophia stood up, followed by Liam and then Noah. They moved without a word, leaving the table in stunned silence. "Come back here, all three of you!" Natalie called out, her voice tinged with panic. "Don't be disrespectful to your father." Liam was the only one who glanced back at her, a sad shake of his head, before he joined his siblings outside. "Ethan," Natalie's voice wavered, desperate. "Do something. Tell them to come back right now." "It's all right, dear," I said firmly. "They already know what I'm going to say. And since it involves them, perhaps it's best if they're not here for this." Natalie stared at me, stunned, first by my defiance and then by her confusion. "Sit down, Natalie," I commanded, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. I took a moment to scan the faces around me, each one reflecting a mixture of anticipation and concern. I've had 20 years of what I thought was a perfect marriage, but recently I discovered something that has turned my world upside down, I said, pausing for effect. The tension in the room was palpable, some faces puzzled, others still smiling, expecting a punchline. But many looked uneasy, mirroring my own feelings. With a heavy heart, I continued. Imagine my shock when I found out that Sophia, my beloved daughter, is not biologically mine. Natalie's sobs shattered the silence, her hands covering her face as she wept uncontrollably. The room was thick with tension. "Would you like to tell everyone who Sophia's real father is, Natalie?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with bitterness. She didn't respond, her cries the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. "Fine then," I said, pressing on. "Does anyone else want to confess who's been with my wife behind my back?" The room fell eerily silent, everyone's eyes flicking nervously from one to another. I stood there, my gaze sharp and accusatory, surveying the stunned faces of family and friends. As terrible as it felt, there was a strange satisfaction in exposing the deception that had clouded my life. I couldn't help but cast a stern look at my brother Michael. He squirmed under my gaze, his guilt apparent. "No one's going to confess?" I challenged, my voice rising. "Do I have to reveal the truth myself?" To my surprise, Michael's wife Ella stood up abruptly, her face flushed with distress. "It's not what you think, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't an affair. We just had a few encounters to help Natalie get pregnant. The whole family was so eager for a boy, especially your mother, and it seemed unlikely that Michael could father a child on his own." Ella's words hit me like a physical blow. The revelation that she knew about Michael's involvement with my daughter was staggering. Looking around the table, I saw it split into two distinct groups. Some were in shock, while others seemed entirely unsurprised. Friends who had been kept in the dark and family members who seemed to have been privy to the situation. As I stood there struggling to process the chaos, friends began to excuse themselves one by one, leaving behind only about 17 or 18 of us, mostly relatives. "Why don't you go play over there?" suggested Chloe, another of Natalie's sisters, as the younger children were gradually ushered away. The teenagers, however, seemed glued to the scene, unwilling to miss any of the unfolding drama. "Well, it looks like you all seem to know what's going on, don't you?" I exclaimed, my frustration evident. "You're all aware of this mess, except maybe the kids." A few of the husbands appeared confused, but no one denied the accusations. "Look, Ethan," my brother started to explain, "it's not what you think. I swear." His words faltered under the weight of my anger. My fierce glare was enough to silence him. "So you all knew that Michael slept with my wife and fathered Sophia, did you?" I demanded, addressing the entire room. No one spoke up, but the silence was telling. No one denied the accusation. "I swear it was just 3 times, Ethan," Ella defended herself, her voice rising in desperation. "Who came up with this ridiculous idea?" I shouted, my frustration mounting. Again, no one dared to speak. Instead, too many eyes shifted toward Margaret, my mother-in-law. "I should have known," I muttered, acknowledging her role in this mess. "Thanks a lot, Mom," I said with a heavy heart. "Your desperation for a son has shattered my marriage." "No, Ethan," Natalie finally intervened, her voice trembling. "Please don't say that. I can't imagine life without you. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive just one mistake?" "One mistake?" I echoed incredulously. "Just one mistake?" "Yes, honey," Natalie pleaded tearfully. "It was only that one time. It seems so foolish now, but back then Mom's plan made sense." "And what about Liam?" I pressed her, my tone firm. "Well, he's yours, of course, Ethan," Natalie assured me. "Wrong," I corrected her sternly. "I've had a DNA test done. His father is the same man as Sophia's." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, a wave of realization hitting everyone. "What are you saying, Ethan?" Ella exclaimed, her voice tinged with shock. "You heard me, Ella," I confirmed, standing my ground. "If my dear brother is Sophia's father, then he's also Liam's father." A heavy silence enveloped the room as this revelation sunk in. "You scoundrel!" Ella snapped at her husband, her voice trembling with fury. "You promised me this wouldn't happen, and then you went off and slept with that woman again," Michael muttered, avoiding eye contact, clearly regretting his actions. "And you!" Ella yelled at Natalie, her voice seething with anger. "I agreed to let you have my husband just that one time, and then you continued sleeping with him?" Ella stormed towards Natalie, her face contorted with rage. Without a word, she slapped Natalie across the cheek, the sound echoing in the charged silence of the room. Ella's anger seemed uncontainable as she continued to strike Natalie, her hands moving with a mix of fury and frustration. It took several people to pull her away, and as she was restrained, tears streamed down her face. "Are you happy now, Mom?" I demanded, glaring at Margaret. She stood there, her face as impassive as ever, giving no hint of emotion. "Who else is complicit in this betrayal?" I challenged, my gaze locking onto John, who was seated across from me. "You traitor!" Chloe suddenly screamed, her voice filled with disbelief. "It's true, isn't it? You did sleep with her that night at the party?" The room fell into confusion, as Chloe's husband Daniel nodded reluctantly, confirming the accusation. Chloe then turned her anger on Natalie. "Have you been with all your brothers-in-law, you shameless woman?" A sense of grim satisfaction washed over me as I added, "Well, it seems John was not the only one." John's pitiful attempts to deny the charges only fueled the chaos. culminating in Chloe landing a sharp punch on his nose. "Don't bother coming home tonight," she shouted at him. "In fact, don't ever come back." Ella, still seething, directed her wrath at Michael. "I'm divorcing you," she declared. "I never want to see you again." The three agitated sisters, Ella, Chloe, and their third sibling, linked arms and headed for the exit, their anger palpable. "You're no sister of ours," they yelled at Natalie as they stormed out. Turning to Margaret, I confronted my mother-in-law. "And you, Margaret?" I said, but she remained unmoved, her gaze fixed straight ahead as Natalie continued to sob into her hands. Finally, Alf, my father-in-law, spoke up, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he began, his words faltering as he struggled to express his remorse. His attempt at an apology was the only one made amid the chaos. Michael approached me then, his hands outstretched and a look of profound shame etched on his face. He seemed at a loss for words, but his expression spoke volumes of the remorse he felt. "Ethan," Michael stuttered. "Ethan, what can I say?" "Nothing," I snapped back. My voice lacked real conviction, and as I swung at him, the punch was weak but well-timed. I caught him on the chin, causing him to stumble backward. He tripped over a chair and fell to the floor, making no move to get up. His collapse seemed to signal the end of the evening's festivities, as the atmosphere soured and the evening lost its spark. Natalie didn't come home that night. After grabbing a few belongings, she never returned. The kids were resolute in their decision not to speak with her for a while, despite my own deep-seated animosity toward her. I had to put their well-being first. Eventually, they softened and allowed her back into their lives, but the dynamics were irrevocably changed. I stayed in the role of dad while Natalie became a more distant figure. Our family was in tatters. Two of the sisters who had stormed out that night filed for divorce, leaving only Ella to stay with Michael. Yet even Ella gave Michael a hard time, clearly intent on teaching him a lesson. A few nights later, when the kids were away, Ella showed up. Her motives were unclear. Whether it was an act of revenge or simply a way to get back at me, I never really knew. What was certain, though, was that I got my share of payback. Our encounter was devoid of any warmth or affection. It was a frantic physical affair that lasted for hours. It felt strange, like being intimate with my wife, but entirely different. Afterward, Ella thanked me and left. It wasn't until months later that I learned she had been involved with some of Michael's friends. Whether her marriage would survive this betrayal was beyond me, and honestly, it wasn't my concern. But I could imagine how difficult it must have been for my brother. About 3 weeks later, one of my other sisters, the one who had always been striking, reached out and invited me to dinner. I agreed, and we went out. The evening unfolded with a pleasant meal, engaging conversation, some flirtation, and eventually, a passionate night together. This time, though, it felt different. After the initial thrill, there was a deeper connection, a sense of intimacy that reminded me of the early days with Natalie. I couldn't quite understand why John had strayed from his marriage. It certainly wasn't due to any lack of desire or connection. In a surprising twist, Margaret's long-suffering husband, Alf, had finally had enough of her interference. He bought a 40-foot yacht and spent the rest of his days sailing around Europe. This turned out to be quite convenient for me and the kids. We frequently joined him on sailing trips, exploring beautiful places like the south of France, Mallorca, and the Canary Islands, creating lasting memories. Sophia, meanwhile, met a young Spaniard during one of these sailing trips and eventually married him. He came from a family that owned one of Europe's largest boat marinas, which turned out to be quite advantageous. As for the boys, they're taking their time and not rushing into marriage. Perhaps they're learning from their father's experiences and understand that there's no need to hurry. As for me, my contact with Natalie is minimal. The kids keep me updated on her life. Apparently, she's taking things day by day and often asks about me. I respond with a nod, not much else to say. Regarding my own love life, I'm contemplating another shot at marriage. This time, however, I'm being more introspective. There's a mutual affection between us, but we're both cautious. John will tell. I want to ensure that my decision to remarry isn't driven by a desire for revenge against Natalie. Though I must admit, the thought of her reaction if I do remarry does bring a wry smile to my face.